and welcome to the Empty Chair, Keeping the Mind in Mind. My name is Previn Karian. Now, if you've just landed on this video for the first time, please make sure you've watched the introductory videos to the whole of this channel, which I will post in the description below. And it may help with questions that might come up for you about the project objectives and what exactly I'm aiming to achieve here. So quick recap, I'm a heterosexual man speaking to heterosexual men. I'm calling for a psychological self-confrontation of ourselves as men. I'm also claiming that women can't help us with this. So I'm not going to be talking about women, but I'll try to isolate the problem of destruction and death as psychological drives in heterosexual men. These are looked at as psychological structures that we are trying to analyze through psychoanalysis. And that type of psychological self-reflection is quite tough for heterosexual men. It's like trying to go through the sound barrier without having a brain melt. Now, in this video, I'll try to explain why it's such a hard thing for heterosexual men to look at our destructive and power urges that specifically target women. I'll also try and outline the psychoanalytic modeling that I have been using throughout my talks and which will need much more elaboration than I can give you in just this one video. So there's going to be a whole series of videos opening this out. I hope you'll be patient enough to follow those through. So this is a specific confrontation with the dark, destructive and shadow side of male psychology that heterosexual men share and have in common when it comes to misogyny. I'm claiming that the act of psychological self-confrontation for us men requires immense moral courage. It requires a mental strength that is not natural or native to us because it is a specific type of self-reflection. It's a psychological self-reflection. And our bio-wiring and our gender stereotyping in society works against us doing that naturally. But it can be done, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So in this video, I'll be opening out Carl Jung's terminology of the shadow in psychoanalysis. It will help us to model the psychological self-reflection that we need to understand misogyny and why misogyny is actually necessary to understand its opposite. And what is that opposite to misogyny? It's a psychological masculinity that does not have a dependency on sex, aggression, or women. So misogyny contains its psychological opposite. But we have to work through the dark shadows of our mind to get there. Now, there will be a more technical video explaining Jung in the Psychosocial Models playlist for those of you who want more explanation about this very clinical term. And that video will look at Jung's book, which is called 2 Essays on Analytical Psychology, which he put together in the 1920s to separate the work he was doing in Zurich from Freud in Vienna. But this video is a practical introduction to the problem of Jung's shadow and misogyny. So how can misogyny be a key to understanding masculinity? Misogyny represents one aspect of the dark shadow of masculinity. And what do I mean by all that? I'll try and explain. Jung has many scattered references to the shadow across his collected works. In the mid-1920s, he thought of it as almost identical with Freud's concept of the unconscious mind. Well, what the hell is that? The unconscious mind is not when you are knocked out unconscious and don't know where you are. In psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic modeling, The unconscious mind contains all the things that we want to forget about ourselves, that we bury in our memories, that we push down in order to function socially and to gain social approval through our ego functioning. In psychoanalysis, this is called repression. The ego has to push back, push down, or disown and split off from parts of ourselves that we don't like to look at. Why? Because the psychological ego has to function in society. So the ego is in control of everyday clock time reality, our social reality. And this means that the male ego has no time to look at its own misogyny. It's focused on social survival and social achievements. Anything else gets pushed down. Where does it get pushed down to? The unconscious mind. Heterosexual men push down our natural misogyny into our unconscious mind, keeping it out of view of our ego functioning. We don't have the psychological capacity to see it, but it sits at the back of our heads wherever we go. It is our psychological shadow. What else are heterosexual men pushing down, and why? Well, these can be our deepest desires for sex, power, or owning territory. But it can also be our deepest abuse that we have suffered and kept secret. Our deepest traumatic childhood memories of pain or losses. But also memories that contain our secret guilt, our secret anxieties, our secret depression, and our secret failures. All of these are kept in our psychological shadowlands of repression, pushed down into the unconscious mind. Now, because of incredible social pressure and gender stereotyping, men have to function in a high-performance way through their egos for social success and social survival. But we also have an inheritance of the chimpanzee brain, which gives us an additional bio-wiring into sex and aggression as part of our natural drives. But to function socially, men have to push those drives down into the unconscious mind. We have to repress our biological inheritance. As a result of this burden of psychological repression, heterosexual men have to develop a huge mental capacity for pushing feelings, memories, and our deepest thoughts and our bio-wired drives down into the back of our mind. We become desensitized to our pain, and we dissociate or split off from our painful memories, desires, feelings, and drives. All that matters is ego functioning and the survival of the ego in a world driven by competition instead of cooperation and collaboration. So psychologically, heterosexual men are defined by the superiority of our ego and the success of our ego functioning. The only psychological toolkit we are given to compete with in life is our competitive ego functioning, not our relational skills. Our ego is our psychological definition in society. And that's why we don't ask for psychological help until that ego really breaks down. So we now have a conflict between the testosterone-fueled male ego and the unconscious mind of repressed pain due to social functioning and repression of bio-wired drives that heterosexual men are conditioned, groomed, and trained not to see. This ego dominance is a psychological resistance that stops us going into therapy until long after the crisis has smashed our lives. It's a conflict between the ego and the unconscious. And that is the title of the first part of Jung's book, 2 essays on analytical psychology. The conflict between the ego and the unconscious. Now, as you can probably work out, the unconscious starts to accumulate and collect up all the negative experiences and blocked drives, the bio-wired drives of men. All our pain, all our failures that men's egos have to repress in order to function societally are gathered in the unconscious. And because this repression sits in the mind for so long as a defense mechanism that grows stronger and stronger and stronger over time, it becomes concentrated into a psychological form which Jung called a complex, of which the inferiority complex is one complex out of many. So we now have complexes forming inside the unconscious mind. Because the conflict between the ego and unconscious is so high in men, the size of the inferiority complex and the feeling of weakness, failures, and regrets grow inside the male psyche, and they erupt into uncontrolled anger, aggression, cruelty, and violence. But the male ego can't see its inferiority because it's been busy trying to find superiority. Inferiority is pushed down into the unconscious. And this battle between the ego and the unconscious is where heterosexual men are psychologically stuck in a blindness that we don't understand because we spend our whole lives trying not to see it. The unconscious mind is the world of Carl Jung's shadows. For every attempt to be superior in the world, men create an opposite inferiority, a shadow that we have to repress in order to achieve our goals and ambitions. And in that shadow world lie the darkest complexes that erupt at unpredictable moments, irrationally, and in an uncontrolled way. It starts acting out, usually in men's relationships, to the people who are closest to us, or the weakest people that we know. Because we need weakness to define our superiority. And psychologically, we can't see what we do. In terms of social gender stereotyping, men are psychologically ego-driven and driven to achieve superiority. And for Jung, this creates a world of unconscious complexes building up inside unconsciously and waiting to explode and pull down the ego. So now let's get back to the psychological self-confrontation of men in misogyny. The specific self-reflection for men here is to look at their own shadow in its different forms. And for me, I'll be concentrating on the shadow forms of misogyny, racism, and fascism. Now, these 3 areas are all different attempts and arenas of superiority in which heterosexual men dedicate their lives to achieve success through exploiting weaker people. But this obsession with superiority creates direct and opposite mental inferiorities sitting in our unconscious mind. And these then create a psychological need to explode into anger, violence, and cruelty. And the more that the inferiority builds up with pain, failures, and trauma, the more aggression, cruelty, and violence is psychologically forming in our unconscious minds, both individually as heterosexual men and collectively as heterosexual men. What we need is a psychological self-reflection that walks into a direct confrontation with our psychological shadows. It means that misogyny as a shadow of heterosexual males is a darkness that men have to face psychologically. And in doing so, we have to find out and face up to those ugly truths about the psychological states that we carry and have to manage in our psyche all of the time. And that is something that women can never understand. But the inability of men to process the facts of misogyny can be seen in their comments to my initial misogyny interview. And it shows us something else. It shows that men are too fragile. Our egos are too psychologically weak to even begin processing our own and individual collective evil. We can't face the destruction that we direct at those who are socially and physically weaker than us. And in the case of misogyny, that applies to women. And this carries on until we reach a crisis of the masculine ego. What is that crisis? Well, the social constructs of civilization that were built on through the superior heterosexual male ego are now being torn apart. Women in the West, and progressively women in other parts of the world, are finding their legal rights and their economic, educational, and sexual power over men, which all adds up to their independence. And they are asserting those rights in social and political structures that used to be occupied by men. Now, women have had decades of feminism to figure it all out. Men haven't even begun. Because we are psychologically fragile, men are falling apart at the pushback from the strong, independent woman with the law and economic power on their side. Economically, legally, women are occupying the space of employment and jobs. Men are getting that feeling that we are losing, not to immigrants, but to women. But there is another group of men whose psychological egos are breaking down. And they're the men who have suffered in abusive relationships with women, whose egos broke down along with their finances, sometimes their careers, a loss of their children and family home, when all they did was to try to work and please everyone. Now, this group of men don't understand how they could possibly be misogynistic when they spent their whole lives being so nice. With deep losses through divorce, relationship breakdowns, and rejection. What do you think their ego psychology towards women is going to be after all that? Now, they might consciously think they're still filled with love, kindness, and adoration for women, that they will do anything for love except go to therapy. But what levels of fear, hate, isolation, and depression might be in their unconscious minds in a direct opposition to their love for women? And for those openly out on the incel misogyny spectrum, where do they even start thinking about their ego and their unconscious psychologically? So the unconscious mind, walking into our shadow and looking at our darkness and our misogyny as heterosexual men, requires an immense moral courage, according to Jung. He thought it was not for the many, only for those who felt called to do so. And he thought it would only be a part of your own personal narrative, your own personal destiny or vocation. But because the crisis in masculinity is creeping in from the edges of our social consciousness and spilling onto our media consciousness, it could be that men might be more receptive to a psychological answer to the problem of masculinity instead of the usual attempts to change our behavior, shame us and punish us, which we just can't seem to correct and hold on to for too long. Heterosexual men need to look at our unconscious minds. If we find the mental capacity to do that, we might find that misogyny gives us a psychological way of finding what masculinity could be. A masculinity without sex, aggression, and women. So this is not the super tough model of masculinity, but it's an enlightened masculinity that is psychologically free from the bio-wired drives and gender stereotyping of society. So to sum up, heterosexual male psychology is gender stereotyped and biologically wired into achieving superiority and conquest through destructive competition over the weak. This gives us men a fragile psychological sense of self because our identity, and that means our sense of our existence, that we exist and how we feel about existing, depends on that superiority. Men's psychological definition depends on our ego superiority, and we carry it into any activity that we do. If that superiority is not achieved, we lose our entire psychological identity, our psychological sense of self, of who we are and how we exist in the world. So to achieve that superiority, the male ego psychology has to block out negative experiences, memories and feelings and desires which don't achieve superiority. These are pushed down and pushed back into an unconscious mind, our psychological shadow, as Jung would call it. And in those shadowlands, there's a growing sense of inferiority and rage that is constantly accumulating. That inferiority complex is a tangled ball of those negative memories, feelings, and thoughts that we push back into the unconscious mind. And this is also where men's natural misogyny is buried. It also means that if you talk about misogyny, you are activating contents in the unconscious mind which threaten the male ego psychology of superiority. So the first reaction to talking about misogyny from men will be rage, anger, and absolute denial that we are misogynistic. We can't even begin the conversation. We cannot handle the statistical facts. And it is this conflict between the ego and the unconscious contents of heterosexual men that we are psychologically stuck with because we don't know how to process and think about our own shadow psychology. Now, I hope this series of videos in this playlist on misogyny will help open that out. There's also a psychosocial models playlist in which there are more technical definitions and elaborations of what I'm saying from a clinical basis. Please remember that these videos are not aimed at women, so I'm not going to keep talking about women and why women hate men and so on. Those are the ego reactions of fragile male egos. I'm trying to help men find a masculine psychology that does not depend on women, sex, or aggression. The next video will work with a few examples of how the shadow works in men's attempts to solve the masculinity crisis in the West without any reference to our shadow psychology or our misogyny. And after that, I hope to create the platform to actually talk about the contents of the unconscious in relation to misogyny. Thanks for listening. I hope to see you there. Please like, share and subscribe, and please donate to protect this project's independence. Thank you.